Hi there, listener, and welcome to episode 220 of the Ski Podcast. This special episode is part of an occasional set of podcasts I'm going to be publishing this winter, focusing particularly on women in the snow sports industry. Chemmy Alcott is probably the most well-known woman in snow sports in the UK. After a racing career that took her to 4 Winter Olympics, she now balances presenting Ski Sunday on the BBC with bringing up her young family and coaching new aspiring racers. I thoroughly enjoyed chatting with Chemmy. She has so much enthusiasm and energy, and as you'll discover, her journey through the different horrendous injuries that she suffered during her time on the circuit is quite inspirational. Before we start, I'd like to thank Intersport Ski Hire for sponsoring the show again this winter and for making all these episodes possible. If you are heading for snow, listener, then don't forget you can save money when you book your ski hire at intersportrent.com and use the code SKIPODCAST. You'll get a guaranteed discount for ski hire in France, Austria and Switzerland. And to make it even easier, you don't need to use a code. Just take the link in the show notes and your basket will automatically be reduced. A quick note on audio. It was a lovely sunny day when I spoke to Chemmy and she was sitting in her garden for the recording. That means you can hear some beautiful bird song, but on a couple of occasions, the sound of some less beautiful planes flying overhead. Right, let's listen to my interview with the ever-inspiring Chemmy Alcott. I'm delighted to be joined today by Chemmy Alcott. Chemmy is perhaps best known to the British skiing public as the host of Ski Sunday, which followed a 17-year career as a ski racer. I hope I got that right. She is a 4-time Winter Olympian and competed at 7 Alpine World Championships, recorded 5 top 10 World Cup finishes, and twice finished 11th at the Olympics, all despite a stack of injuries, which we will come to later. Hi, Chemmy. How are you today?
I'm very good. Hi. How are you, Iain?
I'm good. Whereabouts are you?
I'm actually at home. I'm not at home a lot, but summertime, I try and be very present as a parent with my 2 young boys in the summer, because obviously in the winter, I do invest quite a lot of time in the mountains. And now that they're at school in the UK, I can't bring them out as much as I would hope. So summer is my mummy time, my playtime.
Am I right in thinking that your transport today's interview was by water?
Yes, yeah. I just did a kids drop off at club down the road, and I paddle boarded them there, trying to teach them all about water safety and, using nature around us to start the day with a kind of serenity feeling around us.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with one question. Your name is Chemmy, isn't it? Not Chemmy, as some people have pronounced it.
Yeah.
But I think the origins of that name, the full name, mentioned it to me once. I wonder if you could just explain it for our listeners.
Yeah, it's actually quite a really complex one, because everyone knows me as Chemmy Alcott. If I'm ever travelling anywhere, my passport name is now Chemine Crawford. I've actually had 3 surnames in my life. Chemine comes from the movie El Cid, which was one of the original Gladiator movies. And my mum used to look like Sophia Loren. So when she finally had a daughter, which she ate carrots for 6 months when she got pregnant with me, hoping that would create a girl, because she'd had a bunch of sons already. She thought, oh, my daughter will look like me and I look like Sophia Loren, so I'm going to name her Chemine after a character Sophia Loren plays. Unfortunately, I pop out looking like my dad, but she commits to the name. So I am Chemine, and I used to race as Chemine Alcott. And then my first top 10 World Cup, which was in Cortina, and the Italian commentator was giving it large. He was so excited that there was a Brit, and he was like, and from a Great Britain, we have Chemmy Alcott. So everyone called me Chimney for like 3 years, which I absolutely hated. So then I changed it to my nickname, which was Chemmy, for my whole life.
I knew it was going to be a good story, and now we'll get Chemmy correct. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover. I would like to ask you about your racing career and get behind the scenes of Ski Sunday and the Winter Olympics, discuss your passion for adventure as well. But when I was researching for this podcast, what really stood out to me from your story was those 2 years from December 2010 to December 2012, because I think that period tells us a lot about you and your amazing determination. Let's start with that. Why don't you tell us where you were in December 2010 and what actually happened?
So I just had the most incredible summer training ever. By this point, there wasn't a British speed team anymore. And there wasn't actually funding for me to race, even though I was ranked 8th in the world in the combined. So I joined the Canadian ski team. So I went down to New Zealand, had the most amazing summer training. My equipment was really fast. I was in the form of my life. I'd loved being part of a team, having been a solo individual, quite lonely athlete for a bunch of my career. I finally had teammates and, to mentally buzz against. And I went to Lake Louise. I love Lake Louise. It's a World Cup that I've had historical great results at. And I just, I made a mistake. It was a really small mistake in the last training run. I booted out on coach's corner. Booting out means when you get such a big angle that your plastic of your ski boot, which I had blown out because I got bunions, so it was always a big risk I had, touched the snow. And as it touched the snow, my skis kind of, for a fraction of a second, slid away from me. So I lost the height in the turn that I wanted, which meant that I was still pressing on my skis as I went off the jump. It's called Coach's Corner. It's a lovely jump. It's a kind of steep landing that goes very flat afterwards before the net turns start, which we know at Lake Louise are very challenging. And I jumped so far without control that I actually slap landed on the flat. A lot of people tell me they've seen my crash because they look on YouTube, but actually it's not on YouTube. An Italian broadcasting company, they follow the algorithm of accidents in sports. And 2 minutes after I crashed, they bought the rights to my crash. And so actually it's not on YouTube. When I did Dancing on Ice, it was the most expensive footage ITV have ever bought per second. When I did League of Their Own, which notoriously has a big budget, they couldn't even afford to buy the crash. So it's quite an interesting story that everyone thinks they've seen this crash. And there are multiple crashes of mine on YouTube, but not the big one from Lake Louise.
I was going to say I'll have to seek it out. Maybe I'll have to look at Dancing on Ice again. But effectively, that was a double fracture of the right leg?
Yeah, so it was a compound tib-fib fracture. It was the year actually that for some reason in skiing, there were a lot more tib-fib fractures. So we used to have, as I was growing up in the sport, a lot of ACLs, knee reconstructions. But actually that year there was a change in their ski construction. And it was when we went more straight and narrow. Remember, Ted Ligety was super against it and then he won everything that season. And actually what happened was that for some reason there was more compound tib-fib. So when I crashed, the bones actually broke through the plastic of my ski boots, and I just changed to Atomic, and they had white cuffs. Do you remember? They had white and red cuffs. They gave me so much morphine when I crashed. And when you have a traumatic injury in skiing now, they don't put you in a helicopter, because a lot of accidents happen when they've put you on the bed and they put you in and out the helicopter when you have bones outside your body. So you hang now. You've probably seen this happen. And that's when you know you've got a bad injury, when you're hanging underneath on this really big rope and all you can see is the bottom of the helicopter. And they took me to Banff Hospital. But obviously by the time I landed in Banff Hospital, I had no pain. And they said to me, "Oh, Chemmy, what's sore?" And I realized that I was being a hypochondriac because nothing was sore. And they said, no, we know something's sore because of your screams. And I said, okay, my right leg's a bit wet. And then that's when they started to take the outside cuff. They undid the ski boots and my bones were there. And actually a friend of mine at the time was working on Doctor Who as a makeup artist. And when it came out in the press that I'd had this bad crash, she wrote to me straight away and said, "Did you get some photos so I can copy them for my makeup art?"
And so you were helicoptered off and Glee, not inside the helicopter. And I think one of your great friends from your ski racing career, Julia Mancuso, went with you to the hospital?
And no, actually, she was waiting for me at the finish. So as soon as she saw this situation, she then got one of the team cars and drove to Banff. And so, when I came to, she was there, and then she helped me go in for surgery. I mean, she was incredible. She was winning World Cups at the time, but she deferred her flight so that she could fly me back to London instead of flying straight to Europe, so she could hold my leg on the aeroplane the whole way. I mean, this is what the sport of skiing does. You create incredible friendships because there's so much understanding when things go really wrong.
That is fantastic, but evidently that is an injury that probably would have finished off the career for many people. But shortly after that, if I understand it correctly, you then discovered not only have you got a double fracture of your leg, but your funding had been withdrawn by a British Ski and Snowboard.
Yeah, so I think that was probably the worst day ever, actually, because you know me, and I'm quite a positive person, and I'd flown back home after the surgeries from Banff, and I was sitting here and BBC Sport came over to interview me, and I had this long interview, and then after a couple of hours my painkillers were wearing off and the pain was increasing in my leg. I was getting quite emotional, and then they said, "Oh, also just to let you know, UK Sport withdrew your funding this morning. How do you feel about that?" And I started crying, and I'm quite mortified that I started crying for many reasons, because I'm quite an ugly crier, if I'm honest, a vanity reason. But I thought, they'll never show that on TV. And then the next day, I got a Google alert. every hour on the hour of my face on the BBC Sport website of me crying. And an owner of a gym in London, Third Space, I don't know if you know it, but it's an incredible facility up in Piccadilly, the first one was, saw this interview and said, right, I'm going to get this girl back on skis. She's going to race again and I'm going to help her. And that was incredible. A massive, massive turnaround that someone believed in me. Like UK Sport didn't believe in me. At the time, my national governing body didn't really believe in me, but someone else did. And that really was the trigger I needed to get that rehab up and running.
I mean, it must have been devastating to have got that news. And I guess maybe without that kind of support, you possibly could have even considered retiring there and then. But you actually, I know you said this chap helped with funding, but you were doing fundraising yourself. You were just like picking up the phone and cold calling potential sponsors, right?
Oh, Iain, this started when I was 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, my mum picked me up from Newland House, my primary school, and took me to London in my school uniform. And she'd found this event that was being hosted by Richard Branson that was a business and sport networking event for companies, for corporates. And I rock up as this 10-year-old girl in my school uniform. My mum says to me, right, go and find yourself a sponsor. I was like, what? So I was walking around this room telling people about these big dreams that I had, that I wanted to be, the best ski racer Britain had ever had. I wanted to win the Olympics. And it was a really good learning curve for me to start telling other people to believe in myself, because your family always believe in you, but actually going into a place where it's quite intimidating. And I got my first company sponsor. I used to be sponsored by Army Careers from that day.
That's very impressive. We will come back to you being a very confident 10-year-old when we move on to your career. But it was during that period after you'd had the double fracture, the Lake Louise accident. You mentioned dancing on ice before. Part of that motivation for doing dancing on ice was for the insurance money that they pay you, right?
Yeah, double whammy it was. The physio is incredible on dancing on ice, and I realised I could get free physio twice a day. And the appearance money for actually TV shows isn't huge, but the appearance money when you make a tour is massive. So I went in with that athletic mindset that if I come top 6 in dancing on ice, I will make the tour, and then I can afford to ski again, and I will make my next Olympics. That was my ethos. And I was really lucky, actually. I'd met Torvill and Dean at BBC Sports Personality, and I'd had a great night out doing some dodgy dancing with them. And they were like, this girl needs us. She could provide entertainment. And from that, I got offered a place on the show, and it was incredible. But I didn't enjoy it as much as I would as if I didn't now, because I had such a game face on. Like, I knew that I wanted to make that tour. I had to make that tour if I wanted to ski race again. So I had an agenda, whereas most people go on it to have a good time.
That's interesting. There's a kind of irony there, I guess, that your goal wasn't to segue out of racing and into television, which is where you are now. It was to go back into racing. And when I was reading around this, British ski and snowboard, as they were called then, were kind of a little worried about your comeback involving ice skating?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of people who thought I was doing it to get into the limelight, but I knew my goals. I mean, I've had to fight that a lot. When I was younger, I definitely used my image. I sold my image to get money to put into my skiing. I've done that my whole career. You have to have thick skin. And so I knew that without dancing on ice, I would never get to that last Olympics. I had no funding, and I knew this was my way to increase my profile, get some sponsors possibly coming on board. And so yeah, I definitely had that. I had that feeling left, right and center that I was going to get judged for it. But at the end of the day, I knew that I was sticking true to trying to make my last Olympics, and that was my only way. And
I know you're very competitive. I think that's probably evident. You came fifth overall. You said you were looking to get that top 6 in dancing on ice. When you went out in fifth, were you still cursing and thinking, I could have won this?
Yeah. No, I was really annoyed. I'm really good friends with Chico now, but I remember being really bitter that he'd gone through and I hadn't. And Robin Cousins was one of the judges, and he wanted me to go through. So he was backing me to go through. But there were things on dancing on ice that I was terrible at. The dancing part, for instance, the exhibition part, the looking down the cameras. And actually, when I got knocked out, the guy, Matt Wolfenden, who won the competition, said to me, Chemmy, you would have been so much better if you'd looked down the lens of the camera. And I said, well, you could have told me that week 1. This is week 10, and I'm done now. But, those are things you learn. And for me, I'd learned an incredible new skill on a really short blade. And actually, for all those people, those naysayers who said that I shouldn't have done it, if you look at my stats before my injury and after my injury on any flat terrain, I improved because of dancing on ice. That's why I try and get a lot of athletes to skate now, because I think you learn how to work a blade that's this small. And if you can learn that proprioceptive skills on an ice blade, then you can translate that to flats and skiing.
All right, interesting. Well, I mean, you mentioned injuries. We've already discussed probably the most serious one. It's not a spoiler to say that you came back from injury to compete at the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics. That was after yet another broken leg. Now, I was listening to an interview you did for the BBC, and you've had a lot of injuries in your career. In fact, I might just try and drop a bit of that audio in.
Oh, it's stupid. I have too much metalwork in my leg. So annoying. If it's too strong and I can't focus on the gates, then I'll have some screws taken out, which is the last resort. But it's kind of the only option if I can't handle the pain. But like they said, I think you get used to the pain. A sport like skiing is very unnatural on the body anyway, and you always ski with pain. I can't remember. I can count days that I've skied without pain in my life on my hands. You know, we're not naturally made to throw ourselves down mountains, so pain is in the mind.
So listeners might think they're detecting a theme here. I tried to find out how many broken bones you've had, but I couldn't work out exactly what it is. Only that it's definitely more than 40. Do you have any idea what the total is?
Well, so I did a piece for Sky on my rehab, and they did a massive research into it. And they came up with, I think it was 48 or 49 bones. So that is what is out there on the internet. Obviously, when I shattered my leg, there's a bunch of bones there. My biggest one on paper is when I broke my neck when I was 11, and my neck is now fused together. So that was in a fun race, the British Schoolgirls in Flaine, when I was getting beaten in a head-to-head, and I didn't like getting beaten when I was 11 years old. So I threw my body on the line, and here comes a recurring sequence of what would happen in the rest of my career.
Hopefully then, if they're 48 to 49, you probably won't be able to name them all, but like starting from the top and working downwards, you know, what's been broken there? Right,
so yes, so my neck, I've broken my collarbone, I cracked my humerus at Sandown dry ski slope, which was a really bad one actually. I was 2 millimeters away from paralysing my right arm for a long time. I had to wear a dodgy jumper to school for 9 weeks so that no one touched me in the corridors, because that's how risky it was. I've broken lots of ribs. I've broken my left arm in this position near the radius 5 times. I did 4 of those in consecutive summers in New Zealand when I was a kid, because I used to ski with chicken arms in giant slalom. So I used to get the gates right here. And eventually I was like, oh, I should have straighter arms, and then my arms won't be so weak. Where else? Going down, I've broken my ankles a few times. Obviously my fib fracture. I've broken all the bones in my feet. So I was born, this is a strange story, this is from birth. I was born with banana-shaped bones in my feet. My mum was a swimmer, it was very good for her. But for me, it meant that I had the metacarpal head on my little toe was 8 times as big as it should be. So I had a huge surgery actually to have all of the bones broken in my feet and realigned. And then I have an 1/8 of that joint now, which is why I used to suffer from so many bunions, which I know is not a very sexy word, but it's a real word for ski racers. Oh, I think I've missed a few, but that's a few.
Clearly, when you have so many, it's hard to keep up. I also read when I was looking at things about injuries that at one point you got an eye injury and you just wanted to race with just an eye patch over it. You were that determined to do it.
Yeah, so this was Cortina, very early on in my career. And I used to race with a big face shield like they do in BMX. Now, they actually stop allowing them because they're very dangerous. They can fill up with snow, you can suffocate. I think there is one brand who do them out there still. But I was racing with that, and I caught an edge in one of the fastest corners in Cortina d'Ampezzo. But I caught the edge about 100 meters before this turn, but I couldn't get off the edges. So it's the bizarrest looking video, because for 100 meters, I just ski straight into the net. I had no control. And when I hit the net, my chin guard hit the net first, shattered and broke through the plastic of my goggles and actually lodged itself in my eye. So I remember standing on the corner, being upset, pulling bits of plastic out my eye and thinking I was okay. And then I slipped down to the bottom of the course. And I remember a Canadian friend of mine down there looked up and fainted when she saw me because I had blood everywhere. So she ended up actually coming to hospital with me. And I remember waiting at hospital to have my eye stitched for so long. And I was very stubborn and impatient that I left the hospital, found a German ski team doctor who had a bit of thread. But he said to me, Chemmy, I've only got the thread for the soles of the feet. So it's quite thick thread. It shouldn't be used for faces. Are you okay with that? And I said, yeah, fine, just go for it. So he's there stitching up my eye. And it looks horrendous, this big green thread. But I was like, okay, I'm good to go. I'm good to go. So I go up next day and I'm trying to inspect. But I've got this eye patch on and the TD comes over and he taps me on the shoulder and he's like, what are you doing here? Because he'd obviously seen the crash the day before. And I was like, well, I'm doing my next training run so that I can race. He said, you are not racing. Get off the hill.
Yeah, you'll do anything you can to keep racing, because something else I came across was you had a sort of chest plate built for you. Was that
Vancouver.
the Whistler Olympics?
Yes,
something
so,
like Madonna would wear, made by Gaultier.
Oh, it was amazing. That it was in the Kiska and the last day of training before moving over to Whistler. I mean, this was so silly again. I got late in the turn and instead of missing the gate, and bearing in mind, this is just training before one of the biggest events of my life. I can miss a gate. It wouldn't matter. But I always tell people if you train to fail, then that's what's going to happen. So I was preaching it, and I put my body on the line to make the skate. I threw my legs out there and my ribs just went over it. And I cracked my ribs. And you can race with cracked ribs. It's very sore. But as I got to the Whistler Olympic Village, the doctors are checking me over and they're like, okay, well, you need some protection here. So I had to go on the day that the Olympics opened to the medical village. And I remember just being there in my sports bra with all these people molding this plastic graphite bra on top of me to make sure that my ribs were protected. And ironically, actually, a year later, they started testing underwear, thermal clothing. So I wouldn't have been able to race with that a year later because it didn't let any air through. So technically it would have been faster. But what I should have done was, given myself a bit more curvature because that would have been better.
Oh, well, it's very hard to stop you, Chemmy. Let's go back a bit. You mentioned, skiing in your childhood there. Your first ski experiences were in Flaine, which I think is where you take your family now.
Yep.
You pick that because it's a good resort for beginners?
Yeah. I mean, the Circle of Life, it's super easy to get to. It's an easy travel. And it's ski in, ski out. We're very lucky that my dad was a rugby player, my mum was a swimmer. They weren't allowed to ski when they were competing, but when they retired, they fell in love with it. And the first place they went to, because it was so easy from the airport, was Flaine. And so they bought this tiny apartment there, but it is on the piste. And so it's the easiest. I mean, that's the one thing I say with people when they say, where should I go with kids? I'm like, well, look at how easy it is to get your ski boots onto the snow. Because if you're getting your ski boots on, then you have to wait for a bus, and your 4-year-olds got these horrible plastic boots clamped on that they've never had before. You're going to lose them in that time frame. Whereas if you've got a lift down to the snow, it doesn't matter where you're skiing. Kids don't notice that. Then they're going to be inspired to ski. So I think Flaine is a great resort for that.
I read that you did your first race when you were 3 years old. And I'm thinking, what races do they have for 3-year-olds?
So they have Flèche and Chamois. I think they were a bit more lenient back then because less people raced them. I also, if I'm honest, my mum was pretty pushy. And there's definitely, if I said I wanted to do something, she would move heaven and earth for me to do it. I always tell people that I won that race. And I've got a teddy bear with a gold medal around its neck. And it took my dad 20 years of reading this into the newspapers to call me up and say, you've got to stop lying. You did not win that race. And I was like, of course I won that race. I've got a teddy with a gold medal. He said, oh, everyone under the age of 5 got that teddy with a gold medal. And I said, oh, come on, I must have been fast. And he said, you weren't fast. You stopped to give me a kiss when I was videoing on the way down. And I was like, oh, right, okay. So I never did that again since.
Oh. You still raced at that age. And, you mentioned how you spent a lot of your summers in New Zealand when you were younger. And you mentioned how, your parents are clearly encouraging. They're both very keen sportsmen themselves, and you were out looking for sponsors when you were 10. But did you not also kind of arrange your first trip to New Zealand yourself when you were 10?
I mean, as a mum of a 7-year-old now, I can't imagine him doing this to me in 3 years. The resourcefulness, or you could say obsession, was absolutely crazy. So first of all, I lied to get into the Sandown dry ski slope. I was 7 and you have to be 8. I also did the same to get into the London Youth Games. And I have talked about this before, so people can slate me if you want. But I really wanted to race, and you could only start racing when I was younger, when you were 8. So I fudged my birth certificate a few times so that I could get on the slopes more. And I was at Sandown, and this is before the internet, so it's not like I could go online and look at ski race camps in New Zealand. There was nothing accessible, but they had this notice board up, and on this notice board it said, camps in New Zealand, do you want to spend your whole summer skiing in the Southern Hemisphere? And then it had a rip-off telephone number at the bottom, and I thought, yes, I definitely do. So I ripped it off, and I went home and I climbed on the kitchen counter and I pulled the phone off with its, loopy cord. And I called the number and I spoke to this guy in Scotland. And I had this really long conversation with him about the camp. And he was telling me everything about it. And he's like, are you keen? I said, yes, I'm very keen. And I said, there is one thing that you need to know, though. On the advert, it said that the camp is for teenagers. I am not a teenager. I am 10 years old. Will you let me come? Now, I just chewed this guy's ear off for 50 minutes about everything to do with this camp, whether they'd be doing slalom, giant slalom. And then I threw this bombshell that I wasn't even old enough to come. But I think by then he noticed something in my tone, in my ambition. And he said, listen, why don't you talk to your parents? So then I put the phone down. And then that night we were having a family meal. And I said to my parents, look, I found this ski race camp I could do in New Zealand. I want to go. And I remember my mum saying, well, we're going to have to think about this because there's not just you, there's your brothers. We'll all have to relocate to New Zealand for the summer. I said, no, I'm going to go alone. And she said, really? And so, I mean, I don't know if this is bad parenting, but you've got to understand what kind of young girl I was. I was obsessive. Yeah, they let me go. And I didn't have a mobile phone. I had a one-tel phone card that I walked down from the homestay that I was in. I was staying with a family down there. And I walked down every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. to a phone box. And I called home and I checked in just Tuesday night. And then I walked back up, went to bed, got up at 5 o'clock and went skiing every day. I mean, that's the life.
Well, it is pretty amazing. And you were living in Wanaka, was it, in
Yep.
New Zealand? Yeah, so beautiful place. I've been lucky enough to go there myself, in summer and in winter. Fantastic there. And those summers in New Zealand and your winters as well, and that training, was all beginning to pay off as you go up through the teens. And I think you made your first debut out in New Zealand in 97. Do you remember that race at all?
Yeah, it was a great race. I remember being so nervous. 2 things stand out. I know that I also had a really good result, but I'm going to tell you the other stories because I like telling stories. Two things stand out. I was so nervous that I forgot to take off my training shorts. And I had these tight, this is before training shorts were fully zip, neoprene. I used to wear cycling shorts. This is quite embarrassing, actually. I used to wear cycling shorts, but I didn't think they looked that cool. So I sewed patches all over these cycling shorts. Anyway, I was so nervous that I forgot to take them off. So I did the first run wearing my cycling shorts. My coach was telling me that he thought I'd stop breathing. And when I stopped breathing when I skied, I wasn't very good. So he said, right, sing me a song. So I sang a song, the only song that was in my head. Anyway, watching video back that evening, he sat next to me and he said, do you remember what you sung? And I said, no. He said, you could have sung any cool song in the world, any hard rock song for your first slalom race. Do you know what you sung? And he pressed play and I was singing, heal the world, make it a better place.
It worked though, right?
It did work. I remember, I think I was just behind Zali Segel, who was one of my icons at the time. He'd done really well in the Olympics. So,
well, that was your first debut, and things progressed over through the junior years. I noticed the European Youth Olympics. You picked up medals there, and it kind of reminded me of the Carrick-Smith boys who are coming through at the moment, doing very well at that level. Into the junior worlds, getting top 10 positions there when you're about 19. Beating Lyndsey Vonn, in fact, I think in around 2002.
Big highlight,
right?
Big highlight for me. Big highlight. I've got that printed out on my wall. No, I don't. But yes, I mean, I definitely had some good junior racing.
And, that all culminated, in that early stage of your career by going to Salt Lake Winter Olympics, only 19 years old. I wondered, how that was going as, let's say, a junior. Who were you rooming with at Salt Lake?
Well, Emma Carrick-Hansen was racing, but because I was racing everything, I didn't end up staying in the Olympic Village. I stayed in a homestay again with a lovely family in Ogden, just next to the stadium where we would win the Olympic curling. And then I would travel up to Snow Basin each day. I mean, I just remember a lot about the Olympics, being petrified. I was really scared a lot of the time. The downhill had loads of jumps. The security was ridiculous. It was just after 9/11. We had to drink out of our water bottle every 500 meters up the hill to show it wasn't bomb fluid. Our vehicles were searched. There were mirrors coming on. I mean, there was quite a lot of intensity around that Olympics. But it was an incredible starting point for me.
Yeah, and interesting. You mentioned you competed in all those disciplines, so in different locations. Not so many people do that. I think it's much rarer in modern skiing. But you were a real all-rounder. Can I ask you though about Salt Lake? That was where Alain Baxter won his bronze, but then had it taken away from him. You were a slalom skier as well, and part of the team. Do you remember that particular occasion?
Yeah, I mean, it still gives me goosebumps now. That was iconic for British skiing. Alain was on the form of his life, but he connected two runs, and he had the Scottish flag dyed into his hair, and this is when people didn't wear helmets, so you could see it whilst he was going down. And I remember I had to watch it at the airport before I was flying home, so I was watching the race at the airport, just screaming, going wild, and this was it. He had put the sport that I loved on the map and showed that you could have so much grit and talent and compete with the best in the world. And I remember getting on that aeroplane thinking, this is it. Everything's going to change now, and being so proud of him and the team.
Unfortunately, it doesn't help Alain, but I guess he's been involved in Dave Riding's progress and his World Cup podiums. Maybe that Olympic podium will come. But for you, you started then to move into the top 10. You produced the best result in Cortina for a British woman for, 30 years. Your second Olympics were in Turin, 2006. And the downhill race there was one of your best performances. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's one of the best days of my life professionally and personally for lots of reasons. And I think all the odds were stacked against the women getting a race that day. The weather was really bad. We had massive delays. The light was super, super flat. They didn't dye the piece as much as they do now. I've got video of it, and actually there's only 2 lines at the side, whereas now they put blue dye on every bit of terrain so you could see it. And the track was really cool there. Big jumps, big half pipe at the top. And I remember there was a massive amount of fear before the start of all of us girls. We were huddled together in the start hut. And my coach pulled me to the side and he said to me, Chemmy, today you've got a choice. You can choose to be scared or you can choose to be fast. That is the only coaching advice he gave me. No technical golden nugget in that at all. He just said, right, the next 2 minutes, the choice is yours. And I stood in that start gate and I was like, I'm feeling it. Like, I feel good. I'm going to trust myself. And I had the most incredible run, actually. Matt Chilton wasn't that complimentary as the commentator at the start, but he's certainly ate his words as I got the green light the whole way down. And I actually threw the race away on the easiest turn of the course at the bottom, which is on the flat. And I ground the turn out. So I did a little bit too much underneath the gate and lost a bit of speed. But I was on for the most incredible result of my life.
Well, when you got to the bottom, what place were you at the bottom? Did you then
second.
have to sit and...
I was a few hundredths behind my snitzer.
Yeah, so you're watching people coming through. I mean, we're recording this just as the Paris Olympics have finished. You see so many examples of this, of people like athletes waiting to find out if they're going to be in the repechage, or gymnasts, watching other people taking part and gradually shifting in the order. So I don't know, maybe you thought you were going to pick up a medal and be in the podium, but you're busy wondering, where you're going to be. And it must be I was talking about this with the kids. Obviously, you've alluded to before the camaraderie between all the athletes, but there must be a part of you that's hoping people, don't do so well.
Yeah, I mean, you're crossing your fingers, hoping people ski slow and make mistakes, but not have an accident. You don't want to go as far as that. But actually, in that day I was ranked around 100th in the world, so I was expecting to come maybe 20th. So to come 11th, I was super stoked. I didn't know my splits at that time. It's not like now. You couldn't go online then and see them all. You had to wait until they were printed out that evening, or someone told you. And so I wasn't with my family until after the race. So I didn't know how good I had been, that I'd been in that kind of podium spot area, until I went and saw my family. And I was so happy because I'd come 11th and I'd superseded my expectations and I skied really well and I'd left everything on the limit. And then they told me that, you know, I'd been right in there until the last split. So, but I was still brimming with confidence. And I thought, this is the start. This is just the start. I didn't know then the injuries would come.
So tremendous result. You talk about your family there. Now, after 2006, I think it was in 2007, your mum, who'd been a really big part of your career and helped drive you, she died in 2007, and you had a whole load of injuries as well. That must have been a very difficult period for you.
So yeah, I mean, actually 2006, the last time I ever saw my mum was that day, the day of my Olympic Turin downhill in the finish area.
Gosh, okay.
So that's why it's such a momentous day for me, because we shared that result all together. We shared that happiness. You know, she was there with my fan club hooded jumper. I had Fruit of the Loom print this jumper, not the highest quality, with my face on it, big teeth, but I had no nose because the printing was so bad. But my mum was wearing it, so proud. And last time I saw her was getting on a bus in Italy, going back to her accommodation, thinking that, we had a long future together. And so I think that's why, again, that was a big moment, looking back in hindsight, obviously, because she had been incredible in facilitating my dreams, my ambitions, my obsession, really, with the sport.
Yeah, well, I think that's come through in our conversation so far. I mentioned that you had injuries, in that season after, but you actually came back from that really strongly, and you're getting more top 10, a lot more consistency in your results. So leading into the Whistler Olympics, Vancouver Olympics, we're moving on to now, 2010, your third Winter Olympics. You picked up another 11th as well. I know I've mentioned before you're really competitive. Were you really gutted that you just weren't one place higher?
I mean, yes, obviously. Coming 11th twice, thinking that I'm that close to a top 10 is quite brutal. But Whistler was a brutal Olympics. The preparation wasn't great. Our funding had been completely cut. We didn't have a national governing body. We had mystery donations to get there. People qualified, made the criteria, and weren't allowed to go. One of those being my husband, Dougie Crawford. His dream was to make the Olympics. He'd made the criteria. And then suddenly we were bankrupt, our federation and everything. It was a really nasty, hostile time, to the extent that coaches weren't being paid. I remember I was sponsored by Audi at the time, and I had these winter tires that I bought. So I was storing my summer tires at our base, and a coach sold those summer tires so that they could afford to pay their mortgage. I mean, there was such nasty things going on behind the scenes that I went to the Whistler Olympics thinking, if I don't perform here, then there might not be funding for any British skiers going forward. So the pressure was massive, and I really struggled. I actually straddled 3 times in that week, and I straddled a downhill gate because everything was off. Like mentally, I couldn't handle it. I was crushing under this feeling, that all the pressure. So actually, I'll take that 11th place, because on paper it sounds okay for how I was feeling. And we don't talk about mental health back then.
No, I mean, you're right that we didn't. And I think, to put it into context, everybody would grab at the chance of coming 11th, even competing in any Olympics, but, getting a really good result out of it as well is tremendous. And, just shortly after that, the same year, we've already referred to that awful accident you had in Lake Louise and the funding being withdrawn. You talked about how it was already difficult at that time. So after dancing on ice, you were coming back into racing again. And then in 2013, broke your leg again. So we're leading into now the Sochi Winter Olympics, be your 4th Winter Olympics. But you only returned to training in that year. I think I'm right in saying in December. So just before the start of the season, and there was, no funding around. You mentioned before how you trained with the Canadian team. This time around, you were training with the Norwegians. Is that right?
Yeah, Yeah, so that was a challenging 3 years before Sochi. I broke my legs 3 times in that preceding year, and the last one, like you said, was in Saas Fee actually in late August. So it was a massive race against time. I pre-qualified for the Sochi Olympics, so you can qualify the winter before, but you have to show your form going into the Olympics. And I joined the Norwegian team, who were incredible. I mean, so supportive of me, so helpful, trying to get me back. I went to Bisham Abbey, and then I returned to skiing in December. I was skiing really badly. I was so nervous. I was petrified. I didn't know how to find the freedom to ski my best, because I had this weight of this last Olympics that everyone had told me to not go for. You know, I'd had family interventions, people saying, you've done 3 Olympics, stop it. And they didn't understand that I'm so stubborn, and I just wanted to give it one last go. And I still believed in myself. And then I had a disastrous first race back. I went to a Europa Cup in Innercrems. Don't know if you saw this result. Did you see this, Iain, when you were
I do Googling? Actually know about this. I mean, because, you know, it should have been way below your level, but it didn't work out for you.
Yeah, I mean, Europa Cup, I hadn't done a Europa Cup forever because I was a World Cup skier. And I went to Innercrems, and I think I came 91st. So that was not helping my case to prove my form. That was just showing that I was way off the pace and that I was never going to make it to Sochi. And then I went to Cortina, which is, you know, my heart's in Cortina always. I'm really excited for the Women's Olympics in Milan, the racing to be in Cortina, because it's held so many amazing stories, not just my crash that I talked about earlier, but my first top 10. And then I went there and I had one race. I had this SuperG race, and I was starting number 38. And I remember being in the start gate, and number 37 had started. And there was this excitement in the start gate that shouldn't have been at that level for racer number 37, because she was winning. This athlete was winning. There was green lights going on. There's a TV camera over there. I'm obviously trying to focus on me, but she's winning this race. And then she crashes. So I'm like, right, it's my turn. So I go down, and I'm having a really decent run. And then I get to the middle of this course, and I kept getting thrown off the course and fighting. Like, I was fighting so hard because I knew I had to make it to the finish. And I remember coming over the last big left footer, which was blind, and just sneaking inside the outside gate, grabbing that left ski, grinding the turnout, and then fighting for the finish, and coming in and seeing 23 next to my name. So I 23rd, I'd made World Cup points, and I'd made it. And I'm not embarrassed to say that I celebrated more than Lyndsey Vonn, who won that race, because it meant so much to come through and get World Cup points. And then number 38 starts, or 39, sorry, the girl after me starts, and she comes into 3rd. And then 40 starts, and 40 comes into 31st, and normal order resumes. And what had happened was, for us 3 racers, 37, 38, and 39, there had been a backwind. Now, you always feel like you're unlucky in sport. You always feel like luck is against you. But that day, I got a backwind, and I made it and qualified for the Sochi Olympics. And I thank that a lot.
Clearly, it was fate. So Sochi 2014, your 4th Winter Olympics. And in the downhill there, you got a top 20 result, 19th in the downhill, which I read for you, having had that whole build up to it, having had all the stress of, you know, needing to prove that you were worth your place, and having people tell you that you should have stopped, you know, way beforehand. It felt like a gold, right?
It was massive. I mean, I was 1.8 seconds off winning. It was such short margins, and I had a really scrappy run, and Sochi was a brutal of a downhill course. It was so steep out the start gate that to be able to stand in that start gate and believe in myself, to have the confidence in my right leg, which had taken such a battering over those last 4 years, and to come in with a top 20 was amazing. I wanted to race more. I wanted to race the combined. I wanted to race more events, but I wasn't allowed. And then I remember Graham Bell being in the finish area of my downhill with a mic, ready to hear my retirement announcement. And I threw that out the window because I was on such a high and I was loving it. And I was like, no, sorry, Graham, it's not happening today.
Yeah, I may have seen that interview. Certainly seen, like, you know, one of your interviews where you got so much enthusiasm, and maybe you were talking about Lady Gaga as well, the music that inspired you for the race.
And I just had to stick to my game plan. I kept thinking of Lady Gaga and the Edge of Glory, and, you know, I just went out there and did it.
Yeah, so I used to listen to Lady Gaga, The Edge, in the start gate. And actually, when I do keynote presentations now, I quite often get walked out to the stage with that. But actually, it has a worse effect now because my heart rate gets so excited because it brings out all these great emotions.
Well, I just ask a quick question about the gate. So you talk about that qualifying race or the GS race. I didn't really know how it works. So you're in the gate, you're the next person to go, but you can see how the person in front of you is getting on. You get those split times, do you? You see those?
So you can probably, no, I only heard the atmosphere, but someone saying she's winning in English.
Right. Okay.
So you can watch about 5 races before you go because the interval is normally about 2 minutes. So you've got 10 minutes. So that's why there is a TV screen there. So you can watch before you go. But as you're in the start gate, all you hear is if the girl has crashed. So you will hear the starter say DNF, which isn't great psychologically either.
No, you don't want to know that.
You also don't want to race behind a Croatian athlete because Croatian coaches, when they say go, 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 they say die, die, die. So if you're racing behind a Croatian athlete, all that's in your head is die, 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 die.
Not the most motivational. So Sochi, your final Olympics, and you mentioned about the vibrations. Essentially, had a metal leg at the time. You were feeling it, and you didn't retire immediately after that race, but you did retire relatively shortly afterwards, and segued into your career now, which is broadcasting. And I know you've done a little bit of work earlier on with Eurosport, working with Matt Chilton. But, when did you start working on Ski Sunday?
That's a good question. I think that I had features the year after I retired. I remember proposing that I would go to a couple of Women's World Cups and show Women's World Cup racing. Because obviously I was still in there with all the athletes. I knew them all. I could tell their stories as someone who was a friend of theirs. And Lyndsey Vonn was still skiing at the time. So I think that's how I got into doing features, by getting women skiing out there.
Features is how it started. I know you played a big part in the BBC coverage of the Winter Olympics in 2018, the Pyeongchang event. You're based in the UK for that, weren't you? You were up in Manchester for the Pyeongchang Olympics, but you struck up a really nice rapport with Claire Balding during those Olympics.
Yeah, I mean, absolute legend. And to have the opportunity to sit next to someone like her on your first studio work that you've ever done, and to be taken under her wing, and for her to bring you in for a huge amount more than you'd planned to be involved in, was amazing. And, I owe Claire so much, and we're still friends today. Evidently,
that experience in broadcasting was passed on by her. The opportunity, I guess it was, came up in 2020. I think mainly to do with COVID, but Graham Bell decided to go down the dancing on ice route and chose to do that, and I think that limited his availability for Ski Sunday. So in 2020, you joined Ed as one of the presenters of Ski Sunday, but that was a COVID effective year. So we have talked about this on the podcast before, but some listeners won't have heard about it. But you were basically in luck the whole season, right?
Yeah. So we were the only people working for the BBC who were out of the country. We were a team of 3. We were 2 presenters and a cameraman. We had no producer. We had no editor on site. We were solo bubbling. So we weren't allowed to see anyone indoors for 8 weeks. Although we were allowed to share the gondola with anyone, Joe Bloggs, everyone going. But it was a really interesting time, but it was a great time to really get your teeth into learning a new trade because, well, firstly, I'm working with Ed Leigh, who's one of the best broadcasters, one of the best presenters out there. And he trained me up again. I'm so lucky to be surrounded by people like Claire Balding and Ed Leigh, and then Zoid, Chris Kirk, and the cameraman who'd been doing it for so long. It was a very interesting winter because it was also the winter that Ed demolished his knee week 2, and Ed didn't want to put a downer on the series, so we didn't tell anyone. We pretended he was okay. We kept putting him in a position, and the poor guy was going through so much pain and surgery, but he didn't want anyone to know because he wanted us to be able to provide that escapism for the British public that we'd chosen to do.
I've talked to him on the podcast before. I'll put a link into the show notes, but that was a extremely serious ACL injury. But if I recall correctly, you're saying you're sort of disguising that in the recording. Didn't it also hone your craft because you were very determined to get things done in one take, so you wouldn't have to stand there for too long on a dodgy knee?
Yeah, again, the pressure. I remember thinking, if I fluff my lines now, we're going to have to do this again. and he's already in pain. So yeah, exactly. It put the pressure on. And actually, I think as an athlete, I'd learnt by then that pressure was my friend. You know, I'm that kind of person. If I'm playing paddle now and people are watching, I'll play a good shot because I know they're watching. And it was the same kind of thing. I was like, I've got to do this for Ed. I've got to be better. I've got to be the best that I can be so that he can sit down and raise his leg.
Regular listeners or any regular viewers of Ski Sunday will have seen how the program has probably changed a little bit over the years. Certainly, you don't have to stay in one place the whole time now. You tour around Europe and you decide in advance, you know, where you're going to be going to. How does it work on the features? Because that seems to have changed. You said, you know, you got your kind of break on Ski Sunday by recording features. Seems that there's fewer of those on Ski Sunday these days.
I mean, hopefully I'm allowed to say this, but it's quite understandable that the BBC budget has decreased. So unfortunately, we've got great feature presenters out there like Tim Warwood, Jenny Jones, Amy Fuller, so many of them in the UK who can deliver amazing features, but the cost is higher when we're on site. So Ed and I last season did do a few more features because we're there anyway. I think it is sad. I think we want to see more faces. We've got a huge amount of talent pool in the UK, but we also want the show to be able to survive. And so we'll do whatever work is needed to make sure that after 45 years, Ski Sunday is still on our TVs.
Okay, well, that makes sense. What about another question that people sometimes say to me, or I see, you know, in the discourse going on, that there should be more freestyle coverage. Now, I may know the answer to this, but it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say. There's a lot of the alpine events, but, you know, we have some very successful freestyle athletes out there, including Mia Brooks and Kirsty Muir, two of the newer ones who are doing remarkably well. Why don't we get to see that so much on Ski Sunday?
Well, I think I'm going to surprise you here. I would love to see more of that, especially because you can see our talent pool at younger levels being able to hone that talent in indoor snow domes. We've got rails, we've got jumps. That is why our youth development program in freestyle is so good. And it would be great to be able to show more. And it's all because of rights. Unfortunately, it is not because Ed and I, obviously Ed really wants it. I really want it. I want to show every opportunity of enjoying sport in the mountains, but it is down to rights, and I don't get involved in the politics side, but I know that even for instance a few years ago we didn't have the rights to Dave Riding's winning runs at Kitzbühel, and we had to trade that off in hindsight afterwards. We had to redo the whole show because of that, because in Austria we're allowed a certain amount of races and we'd already shown those races, so we had to in hindsight buy those rights, grovel to them to get that.
That is the answer, and you know, unfortunately that doesn't look like it's going to change in the immediate future, but hopefully it will. I mean, I mentioned some of those younger athletes that we have who are doing really well on the freestyle side of things, and I mentioned the Carrick-Smith boys, you know, who are doing particularly well. I interviewed Zac earlier this year. Martin Bell's daughter is racing now as well. Reese Bell, you mentioned there, Emma Carrick-Anderson was with you at the Olympics in Salt Lake City. Now, I know you have a couple of young boys who are very keen on skiing. Might we see them be another generation of skiers? Might we see some, would they be Alcott Crawfords racing in the future?
I mean, it's a really good question. I get asked it a lot. And if I'm honest, if we had daughters, I would say 100%. I would love it. I think it's an amazing sport for a young woman because there's not many sports out there where women are challenged to take risks like you do in ski racing. But for boys, I think you have to make a lot more sacrifices. I think that there's it's like ego that comes into play. I think that we're probably behind where we need to be already, even though my kids are 7 and 5, because we love living in the UK. I love that they get to do a multitude of sports. Emma and Phil obviously made that decision and they grew up in the mountains and that's where they've lived their whole life. And we have got a place in Flaine and the boys do a lot of skiing and they love it. But I think it would probably be better for them to go more down the freestyle route. I've talked to Pat Sharples about this because my eldest is quite crazy. It means that we can support him without having all the knowledge to make him the best. And there are programs in the UK that we can do. I mean, Dougie comes from Bearsden Ski Slope, so a big shout out to them because they have an incredible freestyle program up there. And, you know, I don't see it past us taking him to Hemel Hempstead to the freestyle night. So I think actually, obviously, the boys can do whatever they want to do. If they want to be ski racers, and Lockie does come on our ski race cabs now, and he does love it. But I just want them to enjoy the mountains and do everything possibly available to them.
Maybe we'll see them in the future, but it was something interesting to me that you mentioned there was about how, I guess, the approach with girls and boys can be a little bit different. And I don't know, listeners may not have noticed this, but, all of my regular episodes feature at least one female voice. I think there's already too many podcasts and too much broadcasting with, middle-aged blokes talking to each other. So I'm always on the lookout for female guests. And, I don't know if it's societal, but I find it a lot more difficult to find female guests than male guests. And you may have kind of alluded to this before in terms of how women, they sometimes become defined by motherhood. And I think this was something in your career. You were the athlete, and then for you personally, things changed a little bit once you became a mother. You were concerned at one point about that loss of sense of self. And, there was a conversation about women dropping out of skiing too early. They're not taking time for themselves. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, well, in skiing, we've seen a couple of athletes try to become mothers. Lara Culturi, Daniela Ceccarelli is her mother, and I was there when Lara, obviously a very incredibly talented skier, was being breastfed in the start arena, and then her mum was trying to race, and it was too challenging on the body. Tamara Tippler may be trying to come back to the sport next season, which will be an incredible story to follow because she's having a baby this summer. Yeah, I think a lot of athletes, when they retire, female athletes when they retire, rush into motherhood because they want that sense of definition. When you're an athlete, you are defined by being a sporting person. And when that goes away, you lose your identity. So that's why transitioning athletes do struggle mentally because I'm Chemmy Ski on all social media. That's who I've always been. Because I've got this unique first name, I would call up people and I'd say I'm Chemmy, and they'd know straight away that I was a ski racer. So you take away the ski racer part of me, then who am I? And I was very lucky to fulfill this dream of getting into television quite quickly afterwards. But then when I decided that I needed to start thinking about family because of the age I was at and the point in my career, I rushed back to getting back to being on television. 2 weeks after giving birth, both times, I was back filming on television. And that was because I wanted to try and prove that I could do it all. And I don't know if I was trying to prove it to other people who were judging me or to myself, or just to try and inspire my sons that I can wear this mother hat, but I can also be a TV presenter. But there were quite a lot of risks involved with that. I mean, with Lockie, within the labour, it wasn't going very well. And I actually said, I can't have a C-section because I need to be skiing in 2 weeks. I mean, that's just mental that was going on in my head at that time. But it's because I'd worked so hard to get into television that I wanted to keep that role. And I knew that I'd be a better mother if I was still working professionally.
For sure, that's very important for your self-esteem and to be able to get back on the slopes again. I guess what I was thinking of is that sometimes you find that a lot of mums who spend more of their time, let's say, on a skiing holiday, preparing for the skiing holiday, getting their family ready, and don't end up spending the time on the slopes themselves. And that's something that you've been very mindful of.
Yeah, there's actual real scary statistics that mothers or women who have skied their whole life then have children. If they don't ski within those first 5 years, then 80% of them will never get back to skiing. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about changing, because you can have time to yourself when you're a mum. It is really hard. And there's a huge amount of guilt with it because you think that you should be with your children at every point in the time. But actually, I found that I was a better mother because I was still following my passions. And it meant that I was very present when I was with them. Because I had quite a lot of time away from them. I'm very lucky that I have a husband who helped me put my career first in those very young stages. So I really try and get women who have become new mums to, I think it's the risk of injury is huge. They've just gone through this massive body transformation and having a baby. They don't have the confidence behind their strength anymore. So they don't want to risk it all and get hurt on the ski slopes. But if you love it, that you can find a way.
I mean, I guess I was thinking that you really are the perfect guest for this episode of, inspirational women in UK snow sports, because if the listener hasn't worked it out from the course of this conversation, you're just incredibly enthusiastic. You've got so much determination. Your energy levels are just ridiculous, over the years, as well as all that racing. We haven't even touched on so many of the other things that you've done in your life, like climbing Kilimanjaro and rafting down the Amazon, scuba diving, etc. And if you'd like to know, listener, about Chemmy's experience of skiing with the point of view camera down in Maribel or the downhill in Cortina, we have covered that before, and I'll put a link into show notes. I don't know that we need to do it again, but what I would like to do is I'd like to come to the close with a quote that I believe is on a photo, a framed photo in your house, which is from Leonardo da Vinci, which says, and you can tell me if I've got this right, once you've tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward. For there you have been, and there you will always long to return. And that obviously is very meaningful.
Yeah, I just think that sometimes in life we start living in our comfort zone. And as an athlete, I pushed my limit and pushed it too far on many occasions. And so now I'm continuously trying to look up and take flight again, whatever that may mean. And a lot of the time it means making mistakes. It means, not suffering from a fear of failure. It means getting out there and pushing myself out that comfort zone, because I still have the confidence to do so. And just because I'm not racing, it doesn't mean that I can't find more avenues to push myself. Just because I'm a mother doesn't mean that I can't find times to get scared every single day. And I think that's quote about looking skyward is such a good pinpoint of that.
Oh, Chemmy, it's been a real privilege talking to you today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I think that seems like a suitably inspirational way to finish things off. So thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to catching up at some point this winter.
No, thank you, Iain. That was a lovely chat. Thank you.
Well, I really enjoyed speaking with Chemmy. If you enjoyed it too, why not let me know? I enjoy all feedback about the show. I like to know what you think, especially about our features. So please contact me on social @skipodcast or by email, theskipodcast@gmail.com. Now, if you like the podcast, there are 3 things you can do to help. Review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps listeners find us. Subscribe, so every episode will automatically be downloaded for you and you can catch up at your leisure. And book your ski hire with Intersport Rent using the code SKIPODCAST or take the link in the show notes. Now, there are now 225 episodes, and quite incredibly, every single one of those episodes was listened to in the last week. We get this every now and again. It probably means someone is really missing winter and is catching up with our back catalogue. So if that's you, listener, I hope you enjoyed your marathon listen. And if it's not you, don't forget there is so much to listen to in that back catalogue. Just have a search around the tags and categories and you're bound to find something of interest to you. Now, the stats also tell me that 49% of our listeners in the last week were in the UK, 16% in the States, and the other 35% spread across the globe in countries as diverse as Albania, Nigeria, and Indonesia. Now, I would like to thank Chemmy for joining me. You can follow her @ChemmySki on social media. You can follow me @Skipedia or @The Ski Podcast. And finally, listener, thank you for joining us wherever you are tuning in from in the world. And until next time, goodbye.